Welcome to our virtual whiskey tasting. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Dan Szor. I'm the founder and the CEO of the Cotswolds Distillery. And today we're going to taste through 4 of our whiskeys and our new make spirit. Before I get started, I thought maybe I could tell you a little bit about the distillery, why I started this distillery, what's special about the place and about our whiskeys. So, as you can tell from the accent, I'm not from around here. I grew up in New York City, actually, and for 30 years I worked in a very different business. I was in finance, and I worked in New York and Paris and London. While I was living in London, my wife, who's British, and I decided to get a place for weekends, and we bought a small farmhouse not far from where the distillery is, and really fell in love with the Cotswolds. And I'd always been a great lover of whiskey, and one day the idea came to me to put these two things together. It was actually in the summer of 2012, as I was looking out on a field of barley growing next to our home. Great place for growing barley here in the Cotswolds. And I thought to myself, with all this barley, why hasn't anyone ever made any whiskey? And that was really the idea that got us going. There was only one problem. I was definitely a lover of whiskey. You could call me a whiskey geek. I had no idea how to make whiskey. So we turned to some amazing mentors that helped us to spec out, put the distillery together, and help us to build our flavor profile. Harry Coburn and Jim Swan. Jim Swan, who's referred to as the Einstein of whiskey, and who's helped many great distilleries around the world get started. And we had Forsyth, which is a 150-year-old coppersmith in Speyside in Scotland, family run, built us our stills and our whole distillery. For that matter, and everything came together in 2014. And in September of 2014, we began mashing and distilling. So we're now in our 7th year, and we have a whole family of whiskeys that we can look on, and a couple of thousand of casks maturing away here in the Cotswolds. One of the things that we love about our distillery is that we get lots of visitors. The Cotswolds is one of the most visited parts of the UK, and we get about 100,000 visitors a year in our distillery and our 2 retail outlets. We run a couple of tours every day. They're all pretty fully booked, and we love to have visitors. We have a great cafe here, and we hope you can one day come and actually do all this in person. But in the meantime, we'll get down to business and take you through our whiskeys and tell you a little bit about them. So the first thing we're going to taste today is actually not a whiskey, but a whiskey spirit, and it's our new make spirit, which we call White Pheasant. And we're so proud of it. Not a lot of distilleries actually sort of sell their new make as a product, but we love it as much as we do because of what it is, what it represents, and we're very proud of it. And so we decided to actually bottle it and put it up for sale. And we think of it as really the core of our whiskey. It's the DNA of our whiskey. So it's a good way to get started. It's also a great way to get started at 11 o'clock in the morning with something that is at cask filling strength, which is 63.5 ABV. So a small sip will give you an idea of what this is about. So a couple of words about our new make and the way in which we make our spirit. Broadly speaking, I would say there's really there's 2 main components in whiskey. There's the spirit, and then there's the cask, and the way in which the cask influences the spirit over time. So we're extremely proud of our spirit. And a lot of people ask us, how can you create a quality whiskey at a young age when everything I see on the shelf from Scotland is in double digit, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. And what we try and explain is that it's actually not all that difficult. If you create a delicious spirit which doesn't require years and years to oxidize and evaporate and take on cask character, and you put it in a highly active, really high quality cask, you get a very good whiskey in a very short time. So I think it's worth talking a little bit before we get into tasting this about how we make our spirit. So one of the things that's unique about our spirit making is, well, it starts with the barley, and of course whiskey basically having only 3 ingredients: barley, water, and yeast. Barley is pretty important, and true to the original vision I had when I had the idea to build this distillery looking out on a field of Cotswold barley, we said that our whiskey would always be made from local barley. And our barley grows about 15 minutes away from the distillery. It's grown on a farm called Aikman Street Farm, and it's a 5th generation family that grows the barley. We vary the type of barley based on the current year's distilling or malting barley. This barley is Odyssey, and it was harvested in the year before it was malted and then distilled. So locally grown barley, which is then taken to probably our closest maltster, which is about 60 miles away in Warminster, and also a really unique maltings. It's Britain's oldest working maltings. It's called Warminster Maltings in Wiltshire. And at Warminster, they practice the art of floor malting, which is a fast disappearing way of malting barley, but originally how it was done around the world, where the barley would be spread on a long floor after having been steeped in water, and then allowed to germinate naturally over several days, during which time it would be turned by hand. If any of you have a chance to go and visit Warminster Maltings, it's a fantastic place. It's like stepping back in time. So we're really proud that all of our barley, 100% of the barley in our whiskey is floor malted. So once Warminster malts the barley, which is essentially, again, germinating it and making it ready for all of the enzymes and the carbohydrate, the starch inside to be accessible. It's brought up here to the distillery, and we mill it with our own mill. We mash it in our mash tun, which is basically combining it with hot water over a period of several hours, and then we ferment it. And we ferment it for an extra long time, 4 days, using 2 different types of yeasts which are really designed to create very fruity esters when distilled, and that extra long fermentation allows for it to develop real character, and that character distills through. The yeast does its job and takes the barley, takes a wort and distills and ferments it to a strength of about 8%. And then the airborne yeast, which is our own imprint on the fermentation, continues to add complexity over those 4 days. We then transferred over to our wash still, Mary, named after Proud Mary of the Creedence song, because she keeps on burning all day long. Mary distills our wash from 8% up to about 25%. And then in the next distillation, the low wine, which is made, will be sent over to Janice, our spirit still. The reference there being Janis Joplin. We take a piece of her heart every day. And Janice will distill up to about 75% in strength. When we're doing our second distillation, we have to choose our cut points where we take the heart of the distillation, which is going to go into the final whiskey. And all of these steps basically were things that were thought about with a view to making the smoothest, the fullest, the richest, the fruitiest new make spirit possible, so that even in a short period of time, it would become a delicious whiskey. And that's really what you see in the new make spirit. It's the result of all that, the culmination of it. So let's have a little bit of a nose. And I tell you, even before noon, it's a really delightful aroma. It's just a great nose. It's full of fruit. We wanted a whiskey that represented that stood for everything in the Cotswolds that's beautiful, that's attractive, that makes it an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's why we've said that we make outstanding natural spirits. We wanted a whiskey that'd be a reflection of the Cotswolds. And the things that grow in the Cotswolds primarily, agriculturally, are cereal and fruit. And you'll find both of those in this new make spirit. You'll get the cereal, you'll get the grain, the malt, and you'll get just loads of fruit. You'll get sort of stone fruit, you'll get green fruit, apple and pear, definitely loads of it. Many of you haven't probably either nosed or tasted new make spirit. It can be traditionally pretty rough. There can be a lot of off notes still in it after the distillation. You can get sort of terps, you can get sort of astringent kind of notes, and a lot of those will be just taken off over the years through the aging process. But the less of that you have in the new make, the sooner you're going to have a really nice whiskey. And that's something, again, we're really proud of. It took us a few months of really honing our distilling process to where we got to this sort of quality of new make. And it's really what we want to show you right now. So I'm going to have a little sip. Now, it's before noon. And this is 63.5 ABV, and there's no water in this. It's not water, by the way. This is our new make. It's easy to drink. It stays in your mouth. It's got a length and really a beautiful finish. And the lack of off notes for something that is, as we say, sort of hot, i.e., right off the, pretty much off the still, is really surprising. And I need to tell you a little. Sometimes we talk about what this can be used for, and certainly, again, people who are really into their whiskey love it because they can understand the whiskey by trying the new make. Lots of mixologists, bartenders really appreciate new make spirit as a great ingredient for cocktails. What I think is really amazing about this is that if you like your eau de vies, if you like your brandies and your sort of schnapses, etc., this would compare to some of the better sort of grappas, aquavits, and schnapses that I've tried. In fact, true story. Just yesterday evening, I got something in the mail. I tend to buy a lot of spirits online. Whenever something sounds interesting and whenever I hear about something new, I want to try it. Especially in lockdown, my spirits collection has been growing by leaps and bounds. And I was watching a TV show where they talked about a spirit that I'd never heard of before called bucha from Tunisia. And it's a distillation of figs, which is very popular in Tunisia, and I had to try a bottle. So it arrived yesterday. And it's a clear spirit, and it was 37.5, pretty low ABV. We'd never bottle anything, I think, quite that low. But it was pretty harsh, and you only got a little bit of figs, but what you got was a lot of alcohol, and you got a lot of the sort of distillation process, and a couple of faults, I would argue, sort of distillation faults. So it to me wasn't necessarily the most pleasant alcohol, and I grabbed a glass of this just to compare. And this is almost twice the strength, and it was twice as smooth. And I thought, why aren't we calling this barley brandy? Because in effect, that's what this is. It's a barley brandy or an eau de vie of barley. So it's something that we're really proud of here, and I hope we'll continue to always offer our new make on display so that it's really a chance to sort of look under the boot, as it were, of our distillery. Cheers. Now we're going to get to our whiskeys. And the first whiskey we're going to taste is our Flagship Cotswolds Single Malt. So I'm going to pour myself a glass so I can nose it as I talk to you about it. But there's obviously a lot of history behind this one because it is our first ever whiskey. It's the first whiskey we released, and we released it in the fall of 2017 after it hit its third birthday. Whiskey to be able to be called whiskey in the EU and the UK now, has to have been aged in oak for a minimum of, or in casks, I should say, not necessarily in oak for, if you're not in Scotland, for a minimum of 3 years. So our first cask was cast in September of 2014, and by the beginning of October of 2017, we had enough stock of the quality that we were looking for, where we felt we could go ahead and release our first single malt. And we did that on, I believe it was the 6th of October, and we had a great big party here at the distillery with 1,500 people. We had actually been offering this whiskey since before we even had stills, so we had a lot of folks who had faith in us and pre-ordered a bottle 3 years prior that actually made the trip up to the distillery to pick up their bottle and share in this in that really happy day with us. So this whiskey is a mix of two different types of cask that have been brought together, and I should say a little bit about our wood program and the importance of wood and the importance of casks in whiskey. It's commonly believed that the influence of the cask probably accounts for 2/3 of what you taste in the final whiskey. And from the start, we knew how important it was to get only the best and most active casks. And in that, we were hugely helped by Dr. Jim Swan, who was one of our two mentors, and who was really one of the top experts in the world on the chemistry of the aging of whiskey and the influence of wood on whiskey. And not only that, but Jim also happened to know the best coopers around the world, and we could have ended up buying kind of questionable casks from questionable dealers, but Jim knew exactly where to point us. And one of the casks that we use, and probably that we use more than anything else, is a cask that was actually developed by Jim Swan. And it's known today as the STR. And STR stands for shaved, toasted, and recharred. And it's a type of cask that Jim came up with, particularly for the accelerated flavor development of a whiskey as it matures. Jim's idea was basically to take an ex-red wine cask made from American oak, and we'll talk about that a little bit, and have that cask shaved on the inside with a plane, so a mill or two of wood shaved off to expose the new wood underneath. Toasted, where you're basically putting a heat source under the cask to heat the wood and kind of caramelize some of those wood sugars. And then the rechar is a process that you'll find in the States, for example, where all casks are charred, which means actually set on fire. They're burnt for 30 or 45 seconds, and that layer of black char helps to, well, first of all, the charring process breaks open the wood and exposes more of the wood so the whiskey can get into the pores of the wood, and it also provides for a certain degree of filtration and also accounts for some of the color that you would find in bourbon. And after a couple of uses, that char needs to be kind of rebuilt, and so the cask will be stripped and then recharred. So this is the idea, although a wine cask would never have been charred in the first place. So it's not really a rechar, it's a first char. So why American oak? Well, so there's two main types of oak used in the whiskey industry. There are others as well. There's Mizunara oak in Japan, etc. But majority of whiskey will be aged either in American oak or European oak. American oak has a tighter pore, tighter grain, and will throw out less tannin into the spirit. Spirit being a solvent will pull everything out of the wood. So if you put your spirit in European oak, you'll tend to get a lot more wood a lot more quickly, whereas American oak will tend to mature slowly or extract slowly over time, and has a lot of those sort of vanilla flavors that people love in whiskey. So Jim's genius was to take an American oak red wine cask, And typically, a cask wood that's been used for maturation will still have 6 to 8 liters of spirit in the staves, in the wood. So there would still be quite a lot of wine in the wood. And then through this process of toasting and charring, it just develops a cask which imparts amazing flavors, of vanilla, of fruit from the wine, of sort of toffee and caramel from the charring process, and it imparts that to the spirit in an absolutely record amount of time. I would say 6 months, really, you already get a tremendous sense of where the cask is taking the spirit. So when we actually started using these casks for our Cotswolds single malt, within 6 months we had deep color, natural color. We had great taste. We still had to wait another 2.5 years before we could call it whiskey. But what we decided to do with our Flagship single malt was to actually take those casks and also blend the whiskey with whiskey that had been aged in the more traditional bourbon casks. And we use first fill bourbon casks, which come to us from Kentucky. We typically will use only really premium, the best bourbon casks you can get, and they'll be from smaller bourbon distilleries. Why do we do that? Some of the larger bourbon distilleries will tend to, once they've emptied their casks, they'll actually steam their casks to get the last couple of liters of whiskey out of the staves of the wood. So what you end up getting is a bit of a dried out cask, whereas with us, we'll use bourbon casks from distilleries like Basil Hayden's, Booker's, which are high-end distilleries which don't actually steam the cask. So when they arrive here at the distillery in the Cotswolds, they're still quite juicy, as we call them, just recently emptied, and they give you those a bit of the bourbon, but they give you those great sort of vanilla notes. And we are actually later this year coming out with a 5-year-old 100% bourbon cask. We love that taste. But by combining the bourbon cask and the STR cask, what we get is something which gives you both the fruit of the Cotswolds and the grain of the Cotswolds. It gives you elements of both. And what we'll typically do is we'll actually marry those two casks together, and we'll start proofing it down by adding demineralized water, and then we'll put that back into cask for an extra 3 months. And it's a process called marriage. And the idea there is that the casks get to know one another, and the whiskey and the water gets to know one another and integrate and mingle, and so those flavors come together. And then after 3 months, we'll empty the casks, and we'll bring it just slightly down to 46 ABV, which is the strength that we bottle at for this edition, and we'll bottle. So let's have a nose, and certainly that fruit that you were able to detect in the new make spirit comes through in this whiskey. So what I get immediately is the same rich sort of fruitiness that you get when you nose our new make spirit. It's still there. It's not been overwhelmed by the cask, and for me, that's really important. I love cask character in a whiskey, but I don't want the cask or the wood to overwhelm the quality of the distillate, of the base spirit. And so there needs to be a nice balance of what you can get from the spirit and what you've gotten from the cask. So definitely fruit on the nose. It's sort of light, it's heathery, it's floral, but it's also fruity. And let's try some. Cheers. So it's 46 ABV, but I would say it's still a very gentle whiskey. It's gentle, but it's very rich, and it obviously still has, to some degree, a kick. I mean, it is a young whiskey. The word that comes to mind with us is exuberance, youthful exuberance. And, it has to be said that in 2017, when we put this whiskey out, it was the only whiskey that we had, obviously, because we were only 3 years old. And we felt that it was a great reflection of us, and we were very happy to put it out, put our name to it. Now here we sit more than twice the age as a distillery of the year that we put this whiskey out, and we have the ability to move away from those 3-year-old sort of casks and move to older casks. So one of the things that we found is that as we move to older casks, there's certainly more finesse, there's more balance, there's maybe a little bit more sophistication, but there's a little bit of that youthful exuberance that we love so much about our Flagship single malt. So our commitment is to continue to offer a wonderful, fun, approachable, young whiskey, easy to drink, and I hope you enjoy it. It's been said that there's something of an English breakfast whiskey in it, that there's notes of marmalade, that there's notes of honey, that sort of stewed fruits, all of these things that come through in it that just make it, again, I would really call this, if there was one word that I would have to use to describe this whiskey, it's approachable, it's dependable, a great everyday dram, full of flavor. I would compare it to some extent to some of the sort of Speyside whiskeys, unpeated whiskeys that you might find. And we have compared it to those, and what we found is that by comparison to most sort of entry-level Speyside whiskeys, this is much more full of flavor, much more rounded, and much richer. And that's what I love about it. So I hope you enjoy. Cheers. Our third tasting, our second whiskey that we'll be tasting is our Founder's Choice. And there's a great story behind Founder's Choice. Founder's Choice is basically a cask strength, 100% STR cask single malt whiskey. And as we were explaining before, the STR, or shaved, toasted, and recharred casks, were the brainchild of Dr. Jim Swan, who helped us in our early days develop our sort of house character, our flavor profile, and also choose the casks we would be using in our wood program. And from the start, I'd always felt that as much as I love the STR cask, we ought to, for our first whiskey, create something that actually blends together the traditional first fill bourbon casks and STRs, which is what we did. But Jim always kind of said wistfully, you should really think about doing a cask strength STR, 100% STR whiskey. And sadly, Jim passed away in 2016, quite unexpectedly. We were counting on having him sort of with us for years to just over time, sample our casks, see how they were coming along, and his valuable insight. But sort of in his memory, we decided to release the Founder's Choice. The STR cask, again, was really an amazing invention. It was first used by a distillery for which he invented it, actually, out in Taiwan. Some of you may have heard of Kavalan. And Kavalan, wonderful, relatively new distillery that's won quite a lot of awards, uses the same distilling equipment as we do, made by Forsyth up in Scotland. And they have a 100% STR cask called the Vinho Barrique, which I tasted even before I had met Jim and knew that he would be such an integral part of our distillery. And I fell in love with the taste of that whiskey. So for me, this was really coming full circle. And the moment at which it came full circle was actually in September of 2016, I guess, or September 2018, when we had a tasting with a London-based whiskey club who were so appreciative and so amazed by the cask strength STR that we decided we just had to bring it out in time for Christmas. And normally these decisions are made a year or two in advance, and this was sort of a month that we had to figure out a package and a label, but it came out just in time for Christmas of 18, and it's been a hit ever since. So let's pour a bit. We are going back now to the higher strength. This is part of a range of whiskeys. We sort of refer to them loosely as our Halo range, which really are cask expressions, and that's what we'll be tasting this whiskey and the next two, and they all are at higher ABVs. We like cask strength and higher ABVs, not because we like to drink our whiskey at extremely high ABVs, but simply because it does concentrate the flavors. It allows you to really get the sense of the whiskey as it's come out of the cask, and it allows you to do the dilution yourself and decide on how much water you personally like, and there's no right answer. In fact, I was always amazed with Jim Swan at his ability, as he knows whiskeys, to bring the ABV down to maybe 10 or 15%. He added just a ton of water. And for him, that was the way to really detect any underlying faults, to really get a sense of the balance of the whiskey. So again, one of the great things about whiskey is as you add water, it becomes almost a different drink. So you can actually taste 3-4 different sets of flavors, really, as you successively add little bits of water. And certainly my personal preference with Founder's Choice is to add a good drop of water. I would say at least sort of 10 to 15% of the dram, and sort of bring it down to probably in the low to mid 50s from its 61% bottling strength. So on the nose, I would say, firstly, that there is a great similarity to our flagship Cotswold single malt, simply because that's 70% STR. So here you're getting 100% of that cask, just more intense. By the way, these casks are made for us in Portugal by a wonderful cooperage just outside the city of Porto called Dias, who worked with Jim to develop the STR recipe. So again, a lot of fruit on the nose, red fruits, dark fruits, berries, and some hint of what's to come. And it's sort of hard to describe, but you do already begin to get slight little bits of sort of chocolate and sweetness, confectionery sort of nose, and then that gets borne out when you on the palate. So let's go straight there. It delivers so much flavor. It's just really incredible what you get from this. Quite literally takes your breath away at 62%. Again, after that sort of first taste, just to make sure it is what I think it is, I'll always then hit it with a little bit of water and then just marvel at kind of the way it opens up, and it really becomes longer. The finish becomes longer. But what I personally get from this is I get coffee, I get chocolate, all of this again coming from that charred wood, and the fact that by charring you're really allowing the whiskey to penetrate deeply into the cask. The other interesting thing about the STR is because these are casks that have been shaved, the staves have been made thinner. And so what you can actually see, and we show this to folks who come to visit the distillery, is you can actually see the line of how far the whiskey permeates the wood, the stave. If you look at a cross-section of the stave, and compared to a regular bourbon cask, it penetrates much more deeply and it gets almost to the edge of the cask. So there's a lot more breathing going on. There's a lot more air exchange going on. And of course, that's one of the main roles of the cask. I always say that there's really three parts of maturation. There's extraction from the cask. There's evaporation, which is the air going in and out, and the famous Angel's Share, the whiskey evaporating through the cask. And there's oxidation, just as you would open a wine a few hours before you served it, just so that it would kind of air out. Same thing happens to whiskey. So all those things come together to just develop a really full-flavored, well-balanced whiskey with a lot of fruit. Something I used to say about the STR cask is that it kind of reminds me of the day that Armagnac met bourbon met single malt. It's like it's got elements of all three. There's a brandy-like quality to it, and I attribute that really to the wine casks and the wininess of the sort of wood. The bourbon element, I think, really comes from that new char, because that's the way bourbon casks, bourbon has to, by law, be aged in a newly charred new cask. And the single malt, again, the more delicate underlying, the barley is a more delicate grain than the sort of corn that you would get as a base in bourbon. So it's really got the best of all worlds, but it's one of the reasons that actually I decided that we should have some bourbon cask in our Flagship, is that there is an element of this which, is almost, it almost transcends whiskey, and it does have that kind of cross between a fine aged sort of cognac and a whiskey. But it's a delightful dram. And one thing I would say also is that for cocktails, if you're a Manhattan person, if you're an old-fashioned person, and I love both of those traditional whiskey cocktails, this is a great choice. I mean, particularly, there is a bourbon quality to it that lends itself really well to those cocktails, and also the strength and the concentration of flavor. As soon as you start dealing with dilution, ice, etc., vermouth, it stands up to all that really well. So enjoy, Founder's Choice. It's hard for me to lie about which one I prefer, given the name that we've put on this, but I hope you enjoy. Okay, so next up is our sherry cask. Never a hard job to drink this one. Truly a guilty pleasure. There are a lot of sort of real whiskey connoisseurs, whiskey geeks, might say that, sort of the sherry bomb, as sometimes people call big sherry whiskeys, are kind of the province of sort of the beginners, and they want a cask that's dead, that has no influence at all, that doesn't hide the distillery character, and that these kind of very jammy, rich sherry casks make whiskey sort of a little bit of a beginner's whiskey. Sorry, I love a great sherry whiskey, and I've always loved sherry-influenced whiskeys, and so from day one, we've always had sherry casks as part of our wood program. Roughly 15 to 20% of our annual cask purchases are sherry casks. And there again, Jim Swan was a huge help, because there are a fair number of bodegas and sherry makers in Spain selling their casks. But there has always been an issue with the quality of those casks, and specifically the presence of sulfur in sherry casks, because once a sherry cask is emptied of its wine, if it's not refilled very quickly, it can begin to get moldy and go off. And so what will happen is people will burn a sulfur candle, and that sulfur will help it'll be an antibacterial, really, an antifungal agent. And in things like wine, you typically don't really taste a lot of the sulfur. But whiskey, with its high ABV and its sort of solvent qualities, will pull the sulfur out of a cask. Sulfur that you can't really even smell when you nose the empty cask. And you won't really tell until a few years down the road that you've got a whiskey that's sulfured and with that characteristic taste, some call it a struck match, or sometimes even of a bit of rotting egg. So we decided from the beginning that the majority of the sherry casks that we would fill would be fresh casks that were seasoned with sherry. And Jim introduced us to a remarkable gentleman who I think is probably the best maker of sherry casks for the whiskey trade in the world, Miguel Martin. And Miguel is a legend in the business, has supplied sherry casks to some of the great distilleries of Scotland, Glenfarclas, others. Having visited Miguel several times in his bodega in Spain, it's remarkable to see how he goes at this. It's truly vertical production, so he owns his own supply of wood. He has sawmills in Pennsylvania and Galicia for his American and Spanish oak, because he makes casks out of both. He has his own cooperage. He'll essentially bring his wood in from the States or from the north of Spain, and he'll air dry it. And of course, the best wood to make a cask with is air dried as opposed to kiln dried. It's a more natural and a more gentle way of drying the wood. So after the wood's been air dried for a few years, it'll go to his cooperage, where by hand it'll be made into a variety of different cask sizes, everything from 50 liters up to big 600-liter pipes. And what we'll typically buy from Miguel are 500-liter butts and 250-liter hogsheads. Miguel makes his own sherry in pretty significant quantities, and all types from Fino to Oloroso to Pedro Jimenez, Amontillados, the list goes on. And he'll then season the casks he's made from the wood that he's cut with the sherry that he's made. And he has a great aging warehouse. In the end of a few years, those casks will be sent off to whiskey makers, and the remaining sherry will be made into sherry vinegar, for which these days, unfortunately, there's more demand than for sherry itself, which is a pity because sherry is a wonderful, wonderful drink. And having toured Miguel's cellars, I can tell you that there's some remarkable sherries out there. In the beginning, we didn't know quite which of the many, many casks that Miguel had to take, so we took a little bit of everything. And broadly speaking, there were two choices on offer in terms of wood. There was Spanish oak and American oak. And we've spoken a little bit about the difference in the two. Spanish oak is a looser grain and tends to throw more tannin and wood character more quickly into whatever is in it. And American oak is a tighter grain and tends to have more vanillins and tends to age in a little bit of a more graceful and slow way. One of the little known facts is that a lot of the sherry and a lot of the wines made in Spain and in Portugal are aged in American oak. So even though that's not local oak, it has to make its way over from the States, it's preferred because in the hot climates of that part of the world, the desire is for there not to be too much wood going into the sherry too quickly, or the wine. So we'll buy casks that have been made both with Spanish oak and with American oak. We've been buying two cask sizes, as I mentioned, 250 and 500 liters. One will typically age more quickly because there's a higher surface to liquid sort of ratio. And then we'll buy casks that have been seasoned with primarily with two different wines. So Oloroso sherry, which is a red sherry, a dark sherry, and it's a dry sherry. It's a sherry which doesn't have a high sugar content. There's a nuttiness to Oloroso sherry. It's a beautiful product. And then, of course, the famous PX, or Pedro Jimenez sherry, which is made from the Pedro Jimenez grape. And the process of making Pedro Jimenez sherry is to basically let the grapes dry, which increases the sugar content, to squeeze them, and then, interestingly, to hit them with alcohol before they've even had the chance to ferment. So Pedro Jimenez sherry is not a fermented sherry. It's actually essentially alcoholic grape juice, little known fact. But Pedro Jimenez, if you've ever had it, is a sherry you could almost stand a spoon in. It's thick, it's syrupy. It's actually great over ice cream. And of course, the two blended together are wonderful in cream sherry. And I suppose that concept of blending is what gave us the idea of this release, which came out for the first time last year in the fall of 2020. And it was to create our own blend, our own marriage of all of these different casks that we got from Miguel. So through multiple tastings, we put together different blends using a combination of American and Spanish oak, large cask and small cask, and Pedro Jimenez and Oloroso seasoned casks. And the result was our first sherry cask edition. Now, the idea with this was to do our blend for the whole year once in sort of August, September, ready for the October launch. And once the amount that we have for the year is gone, it's gone, and we wait until the next year when we do another blend, which might be a little bit different from the first one. We might find that the Olorosos are coming along differently than the PX. The Spanish oak has more influence. What you'll get typically from Spanish oak is more bitterness, more tannin, more of the kind of aromas you get when you're walking around a wine cellar or a sherry cellar, more in particular. And in this blend, there's about 25% Spanish oak, so it's just enough to kind of wake up the whiskey, and then the rest of it is that nice sort of more mellow American oak. We tried a variety of different ABVs. And we settled on 57.4%, so quite high, very close to the 63.5% casking, or about 61% typically emptying ABV. So only a little bit of dilution, just because we felt that 57.5 was really the sweet spot for this whiskey. So let's nose. So there's a gentleness, there's a roundness to it. Certainly that characteristic sort of dried fruit, the Christmas cake aromas that you get from sherry bombs, big sherry whiskeys, is there in spades. And we have to just go right to the tasting. And it's so different, and yet still quite similar to the Founder's Choice, because you are still at the base talking about a whiskey which has quite a wine influence, but it's a different kind of wine influence. Again, there's certainly also I think that in terms of the char that you'll get in the Founder's Choice, the STR cask, which you don't have in sherry casks. They're typically not charred. They're toasted quite heavily, but they're not actually set alight. They're not set on fire. So you don't get quite the aggressiveness of the wood that you do in the STR. You get something that's a little bit more rounded. But what I find amazing about this, and I was admittedly drinking a fair bit of this between the launch and Christmas. So in the run-up to Christmas, one's thoughts turns to what one's going to do for Christmas Day. There is so much Christmas cake in this, and specifically, I think if you were going to sort of make your own Christmas cake, Christmas pudding rather, and if you took sultanas or raisins and you sort of cooked them in salted butter, well, I suppose if you first aged them in whiskey, macerated them in whiskey, and then cooked them in, there's this kind of slightly savory, a little bit of umami kind of note. There's a word in the world of cognac, in the world of French spirits, called rancio. Rancio is really a derivation for rancid, which is kind of, if you think about butter, for example, that's just maybe a little bit gone off, and you get, again, these sort of umami notes, these kind of meaty notes. And rancio is actually a chemically defined, it can be described chemically, note that happens over time with the degradation of wood compounds in spirit, because spirit, high ABV, it's a solvent, so over time it actually eats away at the barrel, and that the release of different compounds over time affects the character of the spirit. So some of the oldest French cognacs are kind of prized for these notes of rancio, this slight salinity, this slight umami, this meatiness. I wouldn't be one to say that in our kind of 3 to 5 year old casks we're developing those rancio notes, but I am clearly getting these kind of nice, that just slight savory quality to it, which just offsets those kind of buttery, the sort of figs, the prunes, the raisins, etc. It's a delightful whiskey to drink. So I'm going to drink some. I love this, and I look forward every year to seeing where this expression takes us. And we will, I'm sure, at some point have single cask expression sherry casks. In fact, actually, we have one right here at the distillery. If you come and visit us, we have a Pedro Jimenez, a PX cask at full cask strength that you can pour your own bottle of, and we'll do more of that in the future, because we do have a great series. We even have some Amontillado casks, and that's a different type of sherry, and we'll continue to develop that alongside our bourbon and our STR cask releases. But for this first foray into the world of sherry, again, 100% sherry cask too. There's nothing but sherry cask whiskey in here. We're quite pleased with this, and we hope you are too. Cheers. All right, so for our final tasting, it's our peated cask, a favorite of all of our distillers for reasons I'll explain. With all these whiskeys, and given that this is a really kind of a personal undertaking for all of us here at the distillery, there's a story behind each one of them, and I think sometimes the stories are as interesting as the tasting and the nosing. So I'll start with the background of this, but I will pour a little bit just so I can nose it along with you as I tell you about why we did this. So originally, it was not our plan to make a peated malt. For those of you who aren't familiar with how peated malts become peaty, it's not, as some believe, from the peaty water in Scotland. It's actually from the peat that grows in Scotland, but that peat is used as fuel for the furnaces which kiln dry the barley after it's been malted or germinated. And it's that smoke, that phenolic smoke from peat fire that comes through the barley and that smokes the barley. And the phenols in that peat smoke actually stick with the barley through the milling, through the mashing, through the fermenting, and through the distilling. There are some compounds that don't pass over, but peat does. And why did I not originally plan? I love peated malts, but I didn't really plan on Cotswolds single malt being peated. Quite simply because if we're trying to create a whiskey to echo our terroir and our provenance, there's really no peat growing here in the Cotswolds. We don't have our peat bogs as they do up in Islay or in the Highlands of Scotland. So we always saw our whiskey as being more sort of driven by the things that are around us, by the grain and by the fruit that grow here in the Cotswolds. But then something happened, which is that Nick, the head of our distillery, and I went over to see our friends over at Penderyn, the Welsh single malt, who also were associated with Jim Swan, our whiskey guru. And we had a visit, and they allowed us to taste something which was a peated Penderyn, which had not been made with peated malt, but had been unpeated whiskey aged in casks that had previously held peated whiskey. And we were amazed at quite how much of the peat in the peated whiskey previously aged in those casks had actually come through into the unpeated whiskey during the aging process. And so on the car ride back, Nick and I turned to each other and said, let's give that a try. And so we ordered quite literally one ex-Laphroaig cask, so Laphroaig being a very peaty Islay whiskey. And we put our unpeated Cotswold single malt spirit into it, and a few months later we tried it, and we were amazed at the way in which it sort of married together with the pretty delicate sort of spirit that we produce. So amazed that we decided to really leverage ourselves to the hilt, and we ordered two. And that's the problem with us. We've always kind of, we're small. We think small initially, but then we kind of grow over time. So 2 turned into 4, which turned into 16, which turned into 50 and 100, and now we probably do, I would say, somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 75 to 100, maybe, peated casks, Laphroaig casks actually, and we do actually purchase them directly from Laphroaig a year, into which we fill our unpeated Cotswold single malt. And it fast became a favorite with our distillers. There is something recognizably whiskey and unmistakably whiskey, and particularly Scotch whiskey, about peat, about the aroma and the taste of peat. And there was something about the way in which the peat taste, flavor, and aroma, but in a light way, because it was coming from the wood rather than from smoking the malt, married with our spirit, that just charmed all of our distillers. Their favorite description of it was smoky vanilla ice cream, which I thought was a great way of describing this. So we'll nose it, and what you'll find on the nose is very little peat. It does not come through on the nose because it's so light. there's only just the faintest whiff of smoke. You just get a nice, well-rounded, sort of a bourbon cask whiskey, which is in effect what this is. And I should maybe mention what kind of casks these are. These are known as quarter casks. Quarter casks are called quarter casks because they're a quarter of the size of a 500-liter butt. So they're 125-liter casks, which are made by taking a bourbon cask, a used bourbon cask from Kentucky, which typically they're shipped disassembled, sort of flat pack, to Scotland. And coopers will basically make new hoops, the steel hoops that go around the outside, in a smaller diameter. So they'll use fewer staves than would have been used for a 200-liter bourbon barrel to make a 125-liter barrel, which is the same height as a bourbon barrel, but just a smaller circumference, kind of looks a little bit more cigar-shaped. And what happens because of that is you just get a bigger surface ratio for a smaller amount of volume. So you do get more accelerated aging. And Laphroaig's probably a greatest use and one of their best known whiskeys is called quarter cask. And what they will do is they will re-rack, essentially transfer whiskey that's been aged in a regular bourbon cask into these quarter casks just to get a little bit of accelerated flavor development. And then we will buy them and we'll use them only once, because really once we've used them, that's where the peat's already sort of come out of them. But that's the type of cask. But again, you know, on the nose, just again, that nice American oak, honey, vanilla, creme brulee sort of taste. But it's really on the palate that you get the peat. So here we go. It's like a slideshow of your trip to Scotland a couple of years ago. It just suddenly, it comes back to you, that whiskey festival that you went to on Islay or whatever, that unmistakably Scottish kind of peated taste, but it doesn't overwhelm our spirit, and that's what's really key. Is what one of the nicest things that a whiskey writer once said to me was that in tasting this whole range of whiskeys, in each of the whiskeys, the distillery character, which is basically the spirit, this stuff, still comes through, and that's really my dream, is never to make a whiskey where what comes out of the cask overwhelms what's come out of the stills. And this is a perfect example of that. It's really a nice marriage of that traditional sort of smoky Islay Scottish sort of flavor with that really lovely, gentle, fruity Cotswolds single malt. So it's a good one to end up on, because once you've got the peat, that's sort of you've got it, and that definitely takes your palate in a certain direction. But the other thing I find amazing about this is that this is at 59.3 ABV. And unlike the Founder's Choice, which I feel really calls out for a couple of drops of water, this one is just so easily drunk at 59 ABV, which is a very high level of alcohol. I think it's the influence of the quarter cask. I think it might be the influence of the peat. But whatever it is, it's just an extremely drinkable whiskey at even a high ABV, in moderation, of course. But it's lovely, and we've committed to doing it. We have a wonderful relationship with Beam Suntory, the owners of the Laphroaig Distillery, and there's as many sort of quarter casks. We're not the only ones, by the way, now. I think the cat's out of the bag on this one. There's a number of distilleries now that are aging in quarter casks because of the flavor, because of the acceleration of the sort of maturation effect, that sort of character that comes out more quickly. But we're really happy to have this as a sort of the nod to the peated whiskies of Scotland. So cheers. And well, before I say goodbye, I just want to say it's been a pleasure sharing this time with you. But the magic of this place really comes out when you come and see us. It's the area that we're in. It's the part of the world. It's a beautiful. I loved it so much. I built a distillery as an excuse to be up here. So I would definitely recommend you come and pay us a visit and plan to spend the day, particularly in the summertime. We've got a wonderful cafe. We've got a wonderful terrace. The views are spectacular. You can soak up the ambience and really enjoy, and there's just so much to do in this part of the world. So I hope to see you up here at the distillery. It's been great to drink whiskey with you in the morning, and thanks again for joining us. Cheers.